Welcome back to the channel. If you love stories where the underdog accidentally steps into a highly dangerous world and ends up completely owning it, you are in the exact right place. Before we dive into this explosive journey of Mafia secrets, loyalty, and undeniable power, please subscribe, hit that like button, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's dive into the Mafia boss's son. The Mafia boss's son. A call to the devil. The freezing, violent rain in Moscow absolutely never washes away massive sins. It simply aggressively forces the thick blood to flow significantly faster, directly into the dark city gutters. Katya Mironova genuinely, innocently, thought she was just exhaustedly finishing a brutal, grueling shift at a cheap, run-down, highly depressing diner, barely managing to scrape by on pathetic tips of exactly 300 rubles. She had absolutely no idea that the terrified, violently shaking little boy she miraculously found, collapsed on the freezing wet asphalt, was actually the highly coveted, biological heir to the absolute most dangerous, terrifying criminal empire in the entire city. She made exactly one single, highly fateful phone call to a mysterious number aggressively written entirely in permanent ink directly on the child's arm. She absolutely did not call for a medical ambulance. She aggressively called the absolute devil himself. And when Roman Morozov aggressively answered, you absolutely did not hang up the phone. You fiercely, desperately tried to simply survive. The flickering, highly depressing neon sign of Sasha's 24/7 diner aggressively buzzed with a dying, pathetic hum, violently casting a sickly, toxic yellow light completely across the freezing, wet asphalt of Fifth Avenue. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. on a miserable Tuesday, an absolute, ungodly hour that belonged exclusively to the deeply desperate and the permanently lost. Katya Mironova exhaustedly wiped the greasy counter with a highly disgusting rag that aggressively smelled of toxic bleach and ancient, rancid cooking oil. Her raw knuckles were bright, violent red, deeply cracked from the freezing cold and the highly caustic industrial soap. At exactly 23 years old, she physically looked significantly older. Extreme, crushing poverty violently ages a person, aggressively drawing deep, heavy lines of pure exhaustion around the eyes and tightly pulling the soft mouth into a permanent, highly anxious frown. She quickly checked the deep pocket of her stained apron. 1,940 rubles. That pathetic, tiny amount was her absolute total earnings for a grueling, bone-crushing 8-hour shift. It absolutely would not be enough to safely cover her rent, which was violently due in exactly 3 short days. But it was barely enough to desperately buy a cheap loaf of bread and perhaps some strong aspirin for the massive, blinding headache that had been violently pulsing behind her temples since early noon. "Lock it completely up, Katya," Sasha grumbled aggressively from the dark, messy back office. "And absolutely do not forget to turn the damn lights off." "I will flawlessly handle it, Sasha," she replied, with an incredibly hoarse, exhausted voice. She aggressively grabbed her highly worn, cheap winter coat, a pathetic thrift store find that was exactly 2 massive sizes too big, and stepped out directly into the piercing, freezing, violent Moscow wind. The icy rain was pouring down exactly like a massive waterfall, completely cold and utterly, terrifyingly relentless. She aggressively pulled her collar high up, desperately bracing herself for the miserable, freezing trek to the dangerous bus stop. And that was exactly when she vividly saw the strange lump aggressively huddled on the dark ground. It lay perfectly still between a massive, overflowing dumpster and a heavy stack of broken wooden pallets completely deep in the dark, highly secluded alley right next to the diner. At first, she simply, rationally, thought it was just a massive pile of discarded filthy rags. Then, the dark pile violently moved. A highly quiet, incredibly muffled, desperate sob violently cut right through the loud, deafening noise of the freezing rain. Katya completely, utterly froze. The dangerous, massive city had brutally, efficiently taught her to absolutely never, ever stick her neck out. Dangerous curiosity in this highly toxic, impoverished neighborhood could easily result in a violent mugging, or infinitely, terrifyingly worse. But the highly pathetic sound violently repeated itself. An incredibly distinct, innocent, childish sound. Childish. She slowly, highly cautiously stepped into the pitch-black alley. Her cheap, worn boots heavily splashed in the freezing, deep puddles. "Hello?" she whispered incredibly softly. The dark lump violently stirred. A tiny, incredibly pale face slowly looked up, as pale as pure moonlight, beautifully framed by soaking wet, highly messy dark curls. It was a tiny little boy, absolutely no older than exactly 6 years old. He was wearing an incredibly expensive, highly tailored, miniature custom tuxedo that must have easily cost significantly more than Katya aggressively earned in an entire agonizing year. But the expensive, bespoke suit was violently torn and heavily caked in thick, freezing mud. His tiny knees were brutally scraped, and bright, dark red blood was slowly, agonizingly seeping directly into the freezing rain. "Hey," Katya stated, immediately, aggressively dropping directly to her knees, literally not caring a single bit about the freezing, filthy mud. "Are you okay? I will aggressively help you." The terrified little boy did absolutely not speak. His massive, beautiful eyes were entirely wide open. Deep, dark, bottomless pools of pure, unadulterated terror intensely staring straight at her. He was violently trembling so incredibly hard that his tiny teeth were loudly, aggressively chattering together. "Can you safely stand up?" she asked incredibly gently, offering her freezing hand. He desperately tried. He aggressively pushed himself up off the freezing, wet asphalt, but his tiny left leg instantly, violently gave way. He let out a highly sharp, piercing, agonizing scream of pure pain and violently collapsed directly back down. Okay, do absolutely not move," Katya urgently soothed him. She rapidly, meticulously examined him for any other massive injuries. "Where exactly are your parents, sweetie?" The boy absolutely did not answer. Instead, he slowly, highly deliberately, extended his tiny left arm directly toward her. He aggressively rolled up the soaking wet, highly expensive sleeve of his bespoke jacket. Right there, aggressively written in highly thick, bold, black, permanent marker, directly on the pale, freezing skin of his tiny forearm, was a highly specific phone number. Absolutely nothing else. No massive name, no pathetic "call mom," just exactly 10 bold numbers. Katya stared intensely at it. A massive, terrifying chill, entirely unrelated to the freezing rain, violently sprinted directly down her spine. This was absolutely not a pathetic, lost child wandering aimlessly in a safe shopping mall. This was a highly calculated, desperate contingency plan. She aggressively pulled her highly cracked, cheap smartphone out of her pocket. Her cold fingers violently trembled as she rapidly dialed the specific number, glaring intensely at the terrified face of the tiny boy. Ring, ring. The heavy line was violently picked up. Absolutely no polite greeting, just absolute, terrifying, dead silence. A massive silence, so incredibly heavy that the actual atmospheric pressure in the alley physically seemed to violently drop. "Hello?" Katya's voice violently cracked. "Who exactly is this?" The deep voice on the absolute other end of the line was a massive, highly resonant baritone, completely calm, utterly freezing cold, and entirely, absolutely terrifying. It sounded exactly like sharp, lethal steel aggressively sliding across rough concrete. Katya swallowed incredibly hard. I found a tiny little boy right outside Sasha's diner on 5th. He is severely injured." Absolute silence. Exactly 3 massive, heavy heartbeats. Absolutely nothing. "Explicitly, precisely describe him," the deep voice violently commanded. Incredibly dark hair. Maybe exactly 6 years old. He is wearing a highly expensive, tiny tuxedo. He has your exact number aggressively written on his arm. Is he currently breathing? Yes, but he violently fell. He desperately tried to aggressively stand up, but his tiny leg, I strongly think it is completely broken. He absolutely cannot get up. Remain exactly, perfectly where you currently are, the deep voice stated. It was absolutely not a polite request. Do absolutely not hang up the phone. Do absolutely not move a single inch. If he is absolutely not there when I arrive, or if he possesses a single microscopic scratch that absolutely wasn't there before, I will actively, aggressively find you and violently flay the skin entirely off your bones. The secure line abruptly, violently went dead. Katya stared blankly at the cracked phone. Her heart was aggressively, violently hammering inside her chest, exactly like a terrified, trapped bird. Flay the skin entirely off your bones. That was absolutely not a highly dramatic, pathetic figure of speech. She profoundly knew with absolute certainty that he 100% meant it. "Who exactly are you?" she whispered incredibly softly to the little boy. She aggressively took off her cheap, massive coat and lovingly, fiercely wrapped it entirely around him, violently pulling him incredibly close to her warm body to fiercely shield him from the freezing, relentless rain. He immediately buried his tiny, freezing face directly into her cheap, highly worn sweater, aggressively clinging to the rough fabric with highly desperate, terrifying strength. They anxiously waited. Exactly 5 agonizing minutes violently passed. Then, 10. Katya desperately contemplated an aggressive escape. She could easily, cowardly leave the tiny boy, anonymously call a medical ambulance, and completely, permanently vanish. But she looked deeply at the child's tiny leg, which was currently bent at a highly unnatural, terrifying angle. And she profoundly knew she absolutely could not selfishly leave him completely alone in the freezing, icy rain. Then, the entire dark street violently exploded with blinding, massive light. Exactly 3 massive, heavily armored black Cadillac Escalades violently screeched around the tight corner, aggressively moving in an incredibly tight, highly calculated formation, exactly like massive, lethal sharks in dark, dangerous water. They aggressively jumped the high curb. The massive, heavy tires violently tore up the concrete sidewalk, aggressively, flawlessly blocking the entire narrow entrance to the dark alley. The heavy armored doors violently burst open in absolute, perfect unison. Exactly 6 massive men violently spilled out. They were flawlessly dressed in pristine, dark, tailored suits. The freezing raindrops beautifully gleamed on their incredibly broad, muscular shoulders. In their massive hands, held low, but absolutely ready for highly lethal, instantaneous combat, were highly advanced, tactical automatic rifles. The massive armed men flawlessly formed a highly secure perimeter with their broad backs entirely to her, aggressively creating an impenetrable, massive wall of solid flesh and thick Kevlar. Then, the heavy door of the massive, central SUV slowly, ominously opened. A highly imposing man confidently stepped out. He possessed absolutely no umbrella, and he completely, utterly, seemed to not even notice the freezing torrential rain. He was incredibly tall, easily well over 6 feet 2 inches, possessing an incredibly massive, heavily muscled physique that aggressively strained the highly expensive, pitch-black Italian bespoke suit. His thick hair was exactly as black as pure pitch, flawlessly slicked back, revealing a highly striking face that was devastatingly, breathtakingly handsome, but completely, utterly as hard as solid granite. Incredibly high cheekbones, a razor-sharp jawline, and piercing eyes exactly the color of a violent, freezing winter thunderstorm. Roman the Thunder Morozov, the absolute terrifying rising king of the elite Moscow Mafia. Katya absolutely did not know his terrifying name, but she intimately, profoundly recognized the massive, suffocating aura of absolute power. It aggressively radiated from him exactly like searing heat from a massive, roaring fire. He walked confidently toward her. His highly expensive designer shoes aggressively crunched loudly on the freezing wet gravel. He looked directly at the tiny boy securely wrapped in her arms, and for exactly one highly microscopic fraction of a second, the solid granite violently cracked. A massive, raw, incredibly agonizing pain violently flashed in his beautiful eyes before the highly terrifying, cold mask slammed permanently back into place. "Lyova," he exhaled sharply. The tiny boy in her arms slowly looked up. "Papa." His tiny voice was an incredibly faint, highly hoarse whisper. Roman Morozov violently dropped directly to his knees, right in the filthy, freezing mud, utterly ruining a 300,000 ruble bespoke suit entirely without a second thought. He aggressively reached out his massive hands, hovering highly protectively over the boy, absolutely terrified of physically touching him and causing him significantly more pain. "I am right here," Roman stated. His deep voice was shockingly, incredibly soft. "I am absolutely right here with you." He slowly raised his piercing eyes to glare directly at Katya. Up incredibly close, his cold eyes were absolutely terrifying. They aggressively dissected her, rapidly, highly analytically, assessing absolutely every single threat, every tiny lie, every single pathetic secret she had ever kept in her entire life. "Did you aggressively call the medical EMS?" he demanded. No," Katya stuttered violently. He was just lying right here." Roman nodded exactly once. He smoothly, effortlessly scooped the tiny boy up into his massive arms, incredibly mindful of the highly traumatized leg. "Demyan!" he barked aggressively. One of the massive armed men instantly spun around. "Boss! Immediately, aggressively bring the elite doctor directly to the massive estate." "Yes, sir." Roman violently turned to confidently walk away. The tiny boy was fiercely clinging directly to his massive neck. Then, he completely, abruptly, stopped. He slowly turned back to Katya, who was absolutely still kneeling in the freezing mud, violently shivering in her highly thin, cheap uniform. The freezing rain plastered her hair directly to her skull. "Get in the damn car," he ordered completely flatly. Katya rapidly blinked. In exactly which one? I absolutely have to go home." Roman absolutely did not raise his deep voice. He entirely didn't need to. "You vividly saw my biological son. You vividly saw my actual face. You are aggressively coming with me." I absolutely saw nothing, Katya pathetically pleaded, violently scrambling backward until she aggressively hit the rough brick wall of the diner. I simply helped him. Please, I just desperately want to go home. Roman smoothly, highly casually, waved exactly 2 fingers. 2 massive, highly armed guards aggressively moved directly toward her. Before she could even attempt to violently scream, one of them aggressively grabbed her arm, absolutely not highly roughly, but with an incredibly terrifying, absolute firmness that clearly left 0 microscopic chance for a desperate escape. Do absolutely not make this highly complicated, miss, the armed guard stated coldly. Katya was aggressively led, practically dragged, directly to the massive, secondary SUV. She frantically looked back at the cheap, highly depressing diner, at her pathetic, miserable life that was undeniably pathetic, but was entirely hers. And she completely watched it violently vanish as the heavy armored door violently slammed shut, permanently sealing her securely inside a highly intimidating atmosphere that heavily smelled of expensive leather and cold gun oil. Interactive question. Roman just abducted Katya. What do you think he's going to do with her? Drop your craziest theories below. The Gilded Cage. The highly tense, massive ride was utterly, completely silent. The heavy windows were so incredibly heavily tinted that the massive city outside was absolutely nothing more than a highly blurred, fast-moving streak of bright streetlights. Katya sat completely wedged tightly between 2 massive, completely silent armed guards who looked exactly like terrifying stone statues, flawlessly carved entirely out of thick meat. Her heart was aggressively, violently hammering so incredibly fast that she physically felt highly dizzy. She wrapped her thin arms aggressively around herself, desperately trying to violently stop the heavy shaking. But the SUV's highly aggressive, elite climate control absolutely could not magically warm her freezing, terrified bones. They drove extremely fast for exactly 30 agonizing minutes, violently turning off the crowded city streets onto highly secluded, winding roads deep in the elite northern suburbs. They rapidly passed massive, towering iron gates and incredibly long private driveways until they finally reached a massive, terrifying fortress. The sprawling Morozov estate was significantly less of a normal house and infinitely more like a massive, Gothic cathedral exclusively dedicated to absolute pure excess. Massive, imposing stone walls, aggressive, blinding searchlights, and highly armed elite patrols with massive guard dogs. The heavy SUV aggressively sped directly through the towering gates and violently screeched to a halt in a massive circular driveway that could have easily accommodated a large commercial airplane. The heavy door violently opened. "Get out," the guard ordered. Katya slowly stepped out, her legs feeling exactly like useless jelly. Directly ahead of her, Roman was already aggressively carrying the tiny boy, Lyova, directly up the massive, towering stone steps. An entire, elite team of people was eagerly waiting, highly uniformed maids, massive men in tailored suits, and a much older, distinguished man carrying a heavy, black medical bag. She was aggressively ushered inside. The massive foyer was absolutely, completely breathtaking. Pristine, imported marble floors, a massive crystal chandelier exactly the size of a small car, and incredibly beautiful paintings aggressively hung on the towering walls that looked exactly as if they rightfully belonged inside a high-end museum. But Katya literally could not appreciate a single bit of it. She felt exactly like a highly filthy, stray dog that had just been violently dragged directly into a pristine royal palace. Aggressively take her directly to the massive library. Roman's deep, booming voice echoed loudly from the top of the grand staircase. He absolutely did not bother to look back. And keep her securely locked there. Yes, Don Morozov, the armed guard replied respectfully. Katya was aggressively marched down a long, unopulent hallway and highly carefully shoved directly into a massive room, heavily lined with thousands of expensive books, reaching entirely to the towering ceiling. The heavy oak door loudly, violently, clicked shut directly behind her. Securely locked, she was completely, utterly alone. She frantically paced the massive room. Her wet, cheap sneakers loudly, highly disrespectfully squeaked completely across the incredibly expensive Persian rug. What the hell is actively happening? Are they actively preparing to violently kill her? She frantically checked her cheap phone. Absolutely zero signal, of course. Exactly 1 agonizing hour, violently passed. The massive adrenaline rapidly began to severely drop, entirely replaced by a highly crushing, bone-deep exhaustion. Katya collapsed heavily into an expensive leather armchair, aggressively pulling her freezing knees tightly against her chest. She stared blankly at the massive, roaring fireplace, where a beautiful fire aggressively crackled, highly toxically mocking her with its beautiful, warm heat. Finally, the heavy oak door violently opened. Roman Morozov confidently walked in. He had completely changed his ruined clothes. He was now wearing highly expensive black slacks and a pristine black dress shirt. The expensive sleeves were aggressively rolled up, clearly revealing highly muscular forearms, completely covered in incredibly faint, highly lethal scars. In his massive hands, he carried exactly 2 heavy crystal glasses, entirely filled with highly expensive amber liquid. He violently kicked the heavy door shut completely with his heel. "Drink this immediately," he ordered, aggressively extending the glass toward her. Katya shook her head fiercely. "I absolutely do not drink." He violently slammed the glass down directly onto the table with a highly sharp, aggressive clack. He took a slow, highly calculated sip of his own drink, completely refusing to tear his piercing gaze away from her terrified face. Lyova is officially medically stable. A highly clean green stick fracture of the tibia and incredibly mild hypothermia. He is actively crying out for you. Katya blinked rapidly in pure confusion. "Me? Why exactly me?" "Because you miraculously found him. In his highly traumatized mind, you are his absolute, heroic savior." Roman aggressively took a massive step closer. The heavy air in the room seemingly, violently thickened. "And now, you are going to aggressively tell me the absolute brutal truth." "I absolutely told you the truth," Katya stated. Her voice violently trembled, but it was highly defiant. "I simply found him completely alone in the dark alley. My biological son was violently kidnapped from a highly secure, heavily guarded location exactly 3 agonizing hours ago," Roman stated. His deep voice aggressively dropped to a highly dangerous, terrifying whisper. "Exactly 2 of my absolute best, highly elite men were violently discovered, with their throats brutally slit open. The highly advanced security cameras were completely looped. It was a highly professional elite job. And yet, he miraculously ends up completely alone directly behind a pathetic, highly disgusting diner in the worst slums. And a random cheap waitress just happens to miraculously find him." He violently slammed his heavy glass directly onto the table. The expensive liquid violently splashed completely over the rim. Katya violently flinched. "Who the hell are you actively working for?" he viciously snarled. "Is it the brutal Russian triad or my highly arrogant brother?" "I absolutely do not know what the hell you are talking about," Katya screamed back. Hot tears finally, violently flowed. "I am a pathetic waitress. I aggressively serve cheap coffee and burnt pies. Look at me. Do I honestly look like a highly trained professional to absolutely anyone? Roman violently stalked directly toward her. He aggressively slammed his massive hands down heavily onto the armrests of her chair, completely, violently trapping her. He leaned in incredibly, terrifyingly close. His handsome face was mere microscopic inches from hers. She clearly smelled the highly intoxicating mix of expensive whiskey and incredibly expensive designer cologne. Pathetic people will aggressively do absolutely anything for massive amounts of money, he hissed dangerously. And you highly appear to desperately need massive amounts of money. I absolutely desperately need money, Katya violently screamed back, her blinding fear rapidly mutating into pure white-hot anger. I currently possess exactly 1,940 pathetic rubles to my damn name. But I absolutely did not violently kidnap your innocent child. I freely gave him my absolute only winter coat. I urgently called you. Why the hell would I actively call you if I had successfully kidnapped him? Roman intensely studied her. He stared deeply into her heavily dilated pupils, clearly seeing the raw, genuine terror in her rapid breathing, heavily noting the pathetic, highly frayed condition of her cheap clothes. He looked intensely at her small hands. Rough, highly calloused, severely chapped working hands. Absolutely not the highly manicured hands of an elite corporate spy, nor the highly steady, lethal hands of a trained assassin. He violently pushed himself completely off the chair and aggressively turned his broad back to her, heavily running a hand completely through his dark hair. If you are actively lying to me, I will absolutely find out, and you will be violently begging for a quick death. I am absolutely not lying, she whispered softly. A sharp knock violently echoed on the heavy door. Don Morozov! Roman instantly, violently, straightened his posture, flawlessly composing himself into an untouchable Mafia boss. Enter. The highly nervous elite doctor cautiously entered. Sir, it is little Lyova. He is in a highly hysterical state. He absolutely refuses to sleep. He is violently screaming. We absolutely cannot safely sedate him due to the highly severe risk of a massive concussion. He is constantly, desperately asking for the nice lady in the massive coat. Roman tightly closed his eyes for 1 microsecond. Massive, crushing exhaustion heavily flashed across his handsome face. He slowly turned completely to Katya. Stand up, he ordered. Where exactly are we going? Upstairs. You are going to aggressively calm my biological son down. And then, I might actually let you go home. Roman looked at her. His handsome expression was completely, utterly unreadable. We will absolutely see. The lion's den. He aggressively led her completely up the grand, towering staircase directly to the massive 3rd floor. They confidently entered a massive bedroom that literally looked exactly like a highly advanced, multi-million-dollar spaceship. Incredibly expensive, massive toys were scattered absolutely everywhere. A highly customized luxury bed, perfectly shaped exactly like an elite race car. Lyova was sitting heavily in the absolute center of the massive bed, his tiny legs securely encased in a heavy cast, his beautiful face bright red and heavily splotchy from violent crying. An elite nurse was desperately attempting to cautiously approach him, but he was aggressively hurling heavy pillows directly at her. Go away! Lyova violently screamed. I desperately want Laura! I want Laura! Katya confidently walked directly into the massive room. Lyova. The tiny boy completely stopped in the dead center of his violent scream. His massive eyes instantly locked directly onto her. Laura! He desperately threw his tiny arms wide open. Katya looked quickly at Roman. He offered a highly sharp, brief nod. She slowly walked directly to the massive bed and sat gently on the absolute edge. Lyova instantly, aggressively scrambled completely over and violently buried his tiny face directly into her stomach, loudly sobbing. "You violently left!" he accusingly cried. His tiny voice was heavily muffled by her cheap shirt. "I absolutely did not leave," Katya stated, instinctively, lovingly stroking his dark hair. "I was just simply downstairs, having a highly important conversation with your powerful dad." "Do absolutely not leave again!" Lyova violently sobbed. "The terrifying bad men. They aggressively said they were going to violently hurt Papa. They aggressively shoved me into a highly dark van. It was incredibly dark." Katya physically felt the tiny boy violently trembling. She slowly looked up at Roman. The terrifying Mafia boss was standing rigidly in the heavy doorway, intensely watching them. His handsome face was completely pale. Upon clearly hearing his biological son explicitly confirm the horrific kidnapping, he looked completely, utterly devastated. "I am absolutely not going anywhere right now," Katya whispered softly to the terrified boy. She slowly, gently, began to hum a beautiful, quiet melody. The exact same, beautiful lullaby her late mother had lovingly sung right before she tragically died. Slowly, the massive, violent tension began to beautifully leave Lyova's tiny, exhausted body. His rapid breathing beautifully evened out. Exactly 10 minutes later, he was deeply, perfectly asleep. His tiny little fist was absolutely still, aggressively clutching the cheap hem of Katya's shirt. Katya desperately attempted to incredibly carefully gently pry his tiny fingers completely loose, but he violently whimpered in his deep sleep and aggressively tightened his grip. She slowly looked up at Roman. "I literally cannot physically move without violently waking him up." Roman stared intensely at the beautiful scene. A highly strange, massive feeling violently flickered in his freezing eyes. Something highly complex, somewhere right between profound, absolute gratitude and highly intense suspicion. He walked quietly into the massive room and smoothly pulled an expensive chair directly up to the edge of the bed. "Then you will absolutely stay right here," he stated incredibly quietly. "For exactly how long?" Roman stared deeply at his peacefully sleeping son, and then directly at the highly battered, utterly exhausted waitress who had miraculously saved his entire life. "Until I explicitly personally tell you that you can legally leave," he replied. "You are officially inside the massive lion's den now, Katya. And until I successfully find out exactly who violently took him, absolutely no one leaves." Katya slowly looked out the massive window. The freezing rain was absolutely still falling, violently cleaning the dark world. But safely inside this massive luxury house, the highly toxic dirt was only just aggressively beginning to violently show. She was officially a highly valuable prisoner. A terrified prisoner trapped completely inside a massive, gilded cage, fiercely guarding the precious cub of the absolute most dangerous, lethal predator in the entire massive city. And the absolute worst, most terrifying part was staring down at the beautiful, sleeping boy. She profoundly knew that she absolutely wouldn't have left, even if the heavy door had been thrown completely wide open. Interactive question. Katya just became a captive in a Mafia mansion. Would you try to escape, or stay to protect the boy? Tell us your escape plan. The devil's offer. The bright morning sunlight absolutely did not gently wake Katya up. It aggressively, violently assaulted her. It completely flooded directly through the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of Lyova's incredible room. Blindingly bright. She violently woke up with a massive start. Her stiff neck was entirely numb from awkwardly sleeping in the uncomfortable chair. The massive bed was completely empty. A highly freezing, sharp panic violently pierced completely through her chest. She aggressively jumped up. "Leova, I am right here," a tiny, quiet voice echoed from the dark corner. Leova was sitting peacefully on the soft floor, heavily surrounded by a massive, highly complex fortress built entirely out of Lego blocks. He was absolutely still wearing his expensive pajamas. His tiny leg in the heavy cast was highly awkwardly stretched out. He looked up at her with massive, incredibly serious eyes. "You snore highly aggressively." Katya exhaled a massive breath of air that she absolutely didn't know she was heavily holding. She frantically ran a hand through her incredibly messy, tangled hair. "I absolutely do not snore. I purr beautifully, exactly like a happy cat." A tiny, highly timid, adorable smile gently touched the very corner of the boy's tiny mouth. It was the absolute first time she had clearly seen him genuinely smile. It completely, magically transformed his entire face, instantly making him look exactly like a normal, innocent child, absolutely not a deeply traumatized victim. The heavy door violently opened, and the warm atmosphere in the massive room instantly, aggressively, plummeted exactly 10 degrees. A highly severe woman confidently walked in, wearing an incredibly strict, tailored gray suit. Her dark hair was violently pulled back so incredibly tight, it literally looked exactly like it actively hurt. And her freezing eyes looked exactly as if they could easily spot a tiny speck of dust from an entire mile away. This was Elena, the elite, highly terrifying head housekeeper. "Mr. Morozov highly demands your immediate presence completely inside his massive office," Elena stated. Her nose slightly, aggressively wrinkled in pure disgust as she stared at Katya's highly wrinkled, filthy, cheap uniform. "I desperately need to urgently brush my teeth," Katya stated, feeling incredibly, highly self-conscious. "There is a luxury guest bathroom directly down the end of the hall. You possess exactly 5 short minutes." Katya looked gently at Leova. "I will be right back." "Okay. Aggressively build me a massive tower." Leova nodded, but his massive eyes highly anxiously, terrifiedly, followed her completely as she quickly left. Katya violently splashed freezing cold water entirely on her exhausted face in a luxury bathroom that was undeniably, massively larger than her entire cheap apartment. She stared blankly into the expensive mirror. Massive, deep, dark circles heavily shadowed her exhausted eyes. A highly disgusting, greasy stain aggressively covered her cheap collar. She looked exactly, perfectly, like what she truly was. A highly pathetic, cheap waitress completely, utterly out of her proper place. She was highly aggressively escorted directly downstairs to a massive, heavy oak door. Elena knocked exactly once, highly sharply, then violently pushed it open. The massive office smelled aggressively of expensive, ancient paper, highly elite tobacco, and pure, unadulterated absolute power. Roman Morozov sat confidently behind a massive, highly imposing mahogany desk. He absolutely wasn't wearing an expensive suit jacket today, strictly just a pristine white dress shirt with the collar highly casually unbuttoned. He looked incredibly, profoundly exhausted, but his piercing gaze was exactly as sharp as a highly lethal laser beam. "Sit down immediately," he stated, absolutely not even bothering to lift his piercing eyes from the highly confidential dossier he was aggressively reading. Katya nervously sat in the expensive velvet chair directly opposite him. She tightly clasped her shaking hands together so they wouldn't violently tremble. Roman slowly turned a thick page. "Katya Mironova, born entirely in Oriol. Mother tragically deceased. Biological father completely unknown. violently dropped out of high school. You aggressively work at Sasha's diner for absolute minimum wage, plus pathetic tips. You currently live in a highly rundown studio apartment in the dangerous Mariino district. You are exactly 2 massive months late on your cheap rent. He slowly looked up, aggressively slamming the massive dossier completely shut. And you possess a highly criminal charge for reckless driving exactly 3 years ago. It was a pathetic, stupid parking ticket that I simply forgot to promptly pay. Katya aggressively defended herself, her pale cheeks violently flushed bright red. And exactly how the hell do you know absolutely all of this? I know absolutely everything, Roman stated with terrifying calm. I absolutely need to thoroughly know exactly who is actively sleeping in the exact same room as my biological son. I absolutely did not ask to sleep in there, Katya violently snapped back. You aggressively forced me. Roman leaned heavily back, tightly steepling his massive fingers. The highly lethal people who violently took Lyova were absolute elite professionals. They profoundly knew his exact, highly guarded schedule. They intimately knew the massive security blind spots. That explicitly, undeniably, means that someone heavily inside this highly secure house maliciously gave him up. Katya completely froze. And you arrogantly think it is me? No, Roman stated, completely, utterly surprising her. If you were actively, aggressively, part of the massive plan, you absolutely would not have urgently called me. You would have aggressively demanded a massive ransom, or you would have violently killed him. He confidently stood up and walked directly to the massive window, staring aggressively out at the sprawling, massive estate. But you are a highly massive loose end. You clearly saw my face. You saw the heavily armed men. You saw the massive illegal weapons. I will absolutely not tell a single soul, Katya fiercely promised. I just desperately want to go home. I have a highly critical shift at exactly 4 p.m. Sasha will violently fire me if I absolutely do not aggressively show up. Roman slowly, terrifyingly, turned around. A massive, dark amusement violently danced in his freezing eyes. You are actually genuinely worried about your pathetic job at a highly disgusting diner? Ms. Mironova, do you fully, profoundly comprehend that you are actively standing inside the highly secure home of the absolute head of the terrifying Morozov crime family? I fully understand that if I violently lose my pathetic job, I will be aggressively evicted onto the freezing street, Katya stated. Her voice was pure steel, completely despite her massive fear. Highly wealthy people like you absolutely do not understand that. A missed shift explicitly means absolutely zero electricity next week. So if you absolutely aren't going to violently shoot me right now, I desperately need to aggressively go to work. Roman intensely stared at her. He was entirely accustomed to greedy women who desperately wanted his massive money, his absolute power, or his handsome body. He was highly accustomed to massive, terrifying men who violently cowered in pure, unadulterated fear before him. He was absolutely not accustomed to a tiny, exhausted girl in a highly stained, cheap apron aggressively demanding to leave so she could go aggressively serve burnt, disgusting coffee. He smoothly reached directly into his desk drawer and violently pulled out a massive, thick stack of cash. It was heavily wrapped in a highly official bank band, $10,000. He aggressively slapped it completely down onto the mahogany desk. This massive amount entirely covers your pathetic rent for the absolute entire next year, and your highly pathetic tips. Katya stared blankly at the massive pile of money. It was significantly more massive cash than she had absolutely ever seen in exactly one single place. It could miraculously, instantly solve absolutely everything. Her massive, crushing debts, her violently broken heating system, her completely empty refrigerator. "I absolutely do not want your dirty money," she whispered incredibly softly. Roman violently raised a dark eyebrow. "Absolutely everyone desires massive amounts of money. Absolutely not bloody, toxic money," she stated firmly. She confidently stood up. "I genuinely helped Leova entirely because he was a highly terrified, severely injured little boy. Absolutely not because I was desperately seeking a massive, pathetic reward." A long, highly tense silence violently stretched completely between them. Roman slowly, aggressively, walked entirely around the massive desk, stopping exactly mere inches completely away from her. He towered highly aggressively over her. His massive presence was utterly, completely overwhelming. "You are an absolute massive fool, Katya Mironova," he muttered deeply. "A highly brave, incredibly stupid fool." Suddenly, the heavy door violently burst open. Demyan, the absolute head of security, violently burst inside. He was completely ghost white. "Boss, you absolutely need to aggressively see this right now." Roman's entire demeanor instantly, violently shifted. The massive amusement completely vanished, entirely replaced by a highly terrifying, lethal predator. "What exactly is it?" "We successfully found the massive, unmarked van they violently used to actively take Leova. It was completely, aggressively burned out at the city junkyard. And we successfully found a highly burned body sitting directly in the driver's seat. It absolutely wasn't one of ours. It was a massive, elite courier." Roman's handsome face violently darkened. "An elite courier for exactly who?" "For the massive Vipers." The Vipers. A highly ruthless, incredibly disorganized, and violently brutal rival gang aggressively ruling the complete South Side. Roman violently clenched his massive fist. "Aggressively prep the armored car." "Wait!" Katya stated, violently stepping forward completely without even thinking. He aggressively spun toward her. His piercing eyes were violently burning with a highly cold, absolute frenzy that literally made her weak knees violently buckle. "What?" "Leova, he is highly terrified. If you aggressively leave while you are this violently angry, he will physically, absolutely sense it. Please, just go say a proper, loving goodbye to him first." Demyan stared blankly at Katya, exactly as if she were completely, utterly insane. "Absolutely no one," arrogantly told Roman Morozov exactly what to do. Roman glared aggressively at her. His sharp jaw violently worked. He took a massive, incredibly deep breath, aggressively shoving the massive, lethal violence directly back into the tight cage completely inside himself. "You are absolutely, strictly staying right here," he fiercely ordered her. "You are absolutely not leaving this highly secure house. Demyan, put a highly armed guard directly on her. If she aggressively attempts to violently leave, securely lock her completely in the basement." "Wait!" Katya violently screamed. "What exactly about my pathetic job?" "I literally just aggressively bought the entire damn diner," Roman stated over his broad shoulder as he confidently strode out. "You are officially on massive, highly paid leave." Interactive question. Roman just bought her workplace. Is this extremely romantic or totally terrifying? Drop your opinion below. The deadly meal. Exactly 2 agonizing days violently passed. The massive luxury mansion was an incredibly gilded, highly secure prison. Katya had absolutely not seen Roman since he violently left for the junkyard. The massive house was incredibly quiet, completely filled with the highly muffled, terrified whispers of the elite staff, who profoundly knew that a massive, bloody war was rapidly approaching. Katya aggressively spent every single waking moment exclusively with Lyova. She deeply learned that he fiercely loved massive dinosaurs, that he possessed a highly severe, lethal allergy to strawberries, and that his beautiful mother had tragically, violently died when he was just a tiny infant. He absolutely did not talk about it very much, but Katya clearly, vividly saw the massive, aching void her tragic absence had violently left entirely in his young life. Roman was an absolute, terrifying protector, a massive provider, but he literally had absolutely no idea exactly how to be a loving, present parent. On the absolute third evening, a massive, violent thunderstorm aggressively rolled in. Explosive thunder violently shook the massive, towering windows of the grand dining room. Roman finally, aggressively returned. He sat heavily at the absolute head of the incredibly long mahogany table, looking completely, utterly exhausted. There was a massive, highly painful, dark bruise violently covering his massive knuckles, and a highly sharp, bleeding cut directly over his dark eyebrow. He ate completely mechanically, intensely staring directly at his glowing smartphone. Katya and Lyova sat securely directly to his right. The highly toxic, massive tension was so incredibly thick, you could literally, physically, cut it with a sharp knife. "Aggressively eat your soup, Lyova," Roman ordered, absolutely not even bothering to look up. "I absolutely do not want it. It looks incredibly green," Lyova grumbled loudly, aggressively pushing the expensive porcelain bowl of pureed spinach soup completely away. "It is highly beneficial for your growing bones," Roman stated incredibly strictly. "Eat." Lyova violently crossed his tiny arms. "No! I desperately want a grilled cheese!" Roman violently slammed his phone directly onto the table. "Leonardo, do absolutely not aggressively test me tonight," Katya smoothly intervened. She clearly, physically sensed that Roman was violently on the absolute edge. "Hey, Lyova, do you vividly remember exactly what we talked about? Massive dinosaurs were incredibly strong, entirely because they aggressively ate all their greens. Look closely at the Brachiosaurus." She gracefully picked up her silver spoon. "I will bravely try it first. If I magically mutate into a massive dinosaur, you absolutely have to eat the rest." Lyova giggled loudly. "Okay." Katya smoothly dipped her silver spoon directly into the thick soup. She slowly brought it entirely up to her lips. The smell was incredibly rich, heavy garlic, thick, creamy spinach, and something completely else. Bitter almonds. It was incredibly faint, almost entirely, perfectly masked, completely underneath the heavy garlic. But Katya had brutally worked in highly disgusting diners for exactly 5 agonizing years. She intimately knew the highly distinct smell of incredibly old, rotten ingredients, and she profoundly knew the highly distinct, sharp smell of toxic chemicals. She completely froze. The silver spoon hovered exactly mere inches completely away from her mouth. "What exactly is it?" Roman asked, aggressively narrowing his piercing eyes. Katya looked intensely at the soup, then directly at Roman. Her heart aggressively began to violently pound. Almonds? Why the hell would a highly expensive spinach soup smell exactly like bitter almonds? She vividly remembered a terrifying, late-night true crime documentary she had recently watched. "Cyanide. Do absolutely not eat this," she whispered incredibly softly. Roman frowned deeply. "What?" Katya violently swatted Lyova's tiny hand completely away, just as he happily reached for a fresh roll on his expensive plate. Do absolutely not eat anything." She violently stood up, aggressively knocking her heavy chair completely backward. "Roman, the soup. It strongly smells exactly like bitter almonds." Roman stared blankly at her for one microscopic fraction of a second. Then, he violently moved with absolute, terrifying, blinding speed. He aggressively snatched Lyova's expensive plate and violently hurled it completely across the room directly against the wall. The expensive porcelain violently shattered into a million pieces. The thick, toxic green sludge slowly, disgustingly dripped completely down the incredibly expensive, imported wallpaper. "Demyan!" Roman violently roared. The massive sound was so incredibly, terrifyingly loud that it literally shook the massive crystals completely in the heavy chandelier. The heavy doors violently burst wide open. Demyan and exactly 3 highly armed elite guards violently stormed in, their massive weapons aggressively drawn. "Boss, violently lock down the entire damn kitchen," Roman snarled. His deep voice was a highly low, terrifying, animalistic growl. "Aggressively drag the elite chef directly to me, and bring the chemical testing kit immediately." Lyova violently began to cry hysterically, completely terrified by the highly sudden, explosive violence. Katya aggressively scooped him up, violently pulling him entirely away from the massive table. "Everything is perfectly fine, sweetie. Absolutely everything is fine." Roman violently spun toward Katya. His handsome face was completely ghost white, his piercing eyes incredibly wide open, with the absolute terrifying realization of exactly how incredibly close his beautiful son had violently come to absolute death. He looked intensely at the spilled, toxic soup, then directly at the violently shaking Katya. A highly armed guard aggressively sprinted in with a small, elite chemical testing kit. He rapidly, expertly swiped a specialized paper strip completely through the thick soup directly on the floor. It instantly, violently turned bright, aggressive, crimson red. "Cyanide," the elite guard confirmed. His voice was violently trembling. "A massive, absolutely lethal dose." A highly heavy, suffocating silence violently descended upon the massive room. If Katya absolutely had not violently stopped him, Lyova would be completely, permanently dead. Roman looked directly at his crying son, then completely at Katya. He slowly walked directly over to them. He looked exactly as if he were about to violently collapse. But instead, he gently reached out and incredibly softly touched Katya's pale cheek. His massive hand was incredibly rough, very warm, and slightly, violently trembling. "You miraculously saved him," Roman whispered softly. "Again?" "Who exactly cooked the toxic soup?" Katya asked. Her voice was barely a fragile whisper. "The elite chef has been loyally with me for exactly 10 agonizing years," Roman stated. His deep voice violently hardened into absolute freezing ice, which explicitly means that someone highly dangerous violently got to him, or someone completely, flawlessly replaced him. "Boss!" Demyan violently interrupted, aggressively listening intently to his elite earpiece. "The massive kitchen is completely empty. The heavy back door is completely wide open. The elite chef has entirely, violently vanished." Roman's piercing eyes turned completely, terrifyingly black. "Aggressively find him. Violently tear this entire damn city completely upside down. I desperately want him alive. I urgently want to explicitly know exactly who the hell paid him." He violently turned directly back to Katya. "Take Lyova completely upstairs. Violently lock the heavy door. Do absolutely not open it for a single soul except for me, not even Demyan." "Where exactly are you going?" Katya screamed, holding Lyova incredibly tight. Roman smoothly, aggressively, pulled a massive heavy handgun, completely out of a hidden holster, perfectly positioned at the small of his back. He expertly, violently, checked the heavy chamber with a loud, sharp, metallic clack. "I'm aggressively going to clean my damn house." Interactive question. A lethal assassination attempt with cyanide. Who do you think is actively trying to murder the Mafia boss's son? Leave your predictions below. The panic room and the ultimate stand. The freezing night violently mutated into a highly terrifying, blurry mixture of pure, unadulterated terror. Katya sat rigidly in Lyova's massive room, her back pressed incredibly hard, directly against the heavy locked door. She had violently, desperately shoved a massive, heavy dresser completely in front of it just to be absolutely safe. Lyova was sleeping fitfully in his massive bed, completely, utterly exhausted from violently crying. Directly downstairs, she clearly horrifyingly heard violent screaming. The occasional terrifying sound of something incredibly heavy being violently smashed into a million pieces. She desperately tried to completely cover her ears, but she literally could not magically block out the horrific reality of exactly where the hell she was. This was absolutely not a highly dramatic action movie. These were highly toxic, lethal people aggressively doing highly terrifying, horrific things completely to each other. At exactly 3 a.m., the massive, violent noise completely stopped. A highly soft, gentle knock echoed on the heavy door. "Katya, it's Roman." His deep voice sounded incredibly hoarse. Katya violently hesitated. She slowly, agonizingly pushed the heavy dresser completely out of the way, wincing heavily at the loud, sharp scraping sound. She carefully unlocked the heavy door and slowly opened it just a tiny crack. Roman was standing completely still in the dark hallway. He had entirely removed his expensive dress shirt. His highly muscular chest and massive arms were completely, heavily covered in thick sweat and bright, dark red stains. In his massive hand, he held a completely wet, bloody towel, aggressively wiping the back of his thick neck. "Is he deeply asleep?" Roman asked softly. "Yes." Roman nodded slowly. He leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, looking exactly like a terrified man actively carrying the massive weight of the entire planet. "It is completely done. The elite chef was successfully found," he explicitly spoke before he finally ran out. Katya absolutely did not ask exactly what "ran out" meant. She desperately did not want to know. "Who exactly was it?" "My biological brother," Roman stated. The heavy words violently dropped exactly like massive, crushing stones. "Andrei. He desperately wants the massive throne. He arrogantly thought that if he violently killed Lyova, I would be way too completely, utterly broken to aggressively rule." "Your biological brother," Katya exhaled sharply. The massive, toxic betrayal violently twisted her stomach into tight knots. In this highly toxic life, shared blood means absolutely nothing, Roman stated incredibly bitterly. Absolute loyalty is incredibly rare, significantly rarer than massive, flawless diamonds. He looked directly at her. Then he truly, genuinely looked at her. In the dim, soft light of the dark hallway, his highly sharp, terrifying features beautifully softened. "You absolutely do not belong in this horrific world, Katya. You are incredibly soft. You are highly kind. You possess absolutely zero armor." "I possess massive armor," Katya argued incredibly quietly. "I survived for so incredibly long completely alone. Deep poverty is one massive thing." Roman aggressively took a massive step closer, completely, violently invading her personal space. This is absolute war, and you are actively standing directly on the highly lethal front lines." He slowly reached out, his massive hand hovering just inches completely over her soft shoulder. He seemingly, desperately, wanted to violently pull her completely against him, but he abruptly stopped. He stared intently at his own hand, a hand that had literally just committed massive, horrific violence, and he aggressively pulled it back, exactly as if he were absolutely terrified that he would permanently, violently stain her. "I absolutely have to send you completely away," Roman stated firmly. "It is absolutely not safe here. Andrei clearly knows that you successfully saved Lyova. You are now a highly valuable, massive target. So you are aggressively kicking me out." Katya physically felt a highly strange, massive pang of deep pain. "I am aggressively sending you directly to a highly secure, massive safe house in Switzerland. You will possess a completely brand new identity. Massive amounts of money. You can completely, peacefully start all over. Finally go to elite university. Be completely, perfectly safe." "And Lyova?" Katya asked quickly. "What exactly about him? He absolutely will not eat without me. He fiercely trusts me." "He will eventually, quickly forget," Roman stated, although he sounded incredibly unconvincing. "He is incredibly young. He absolutely will not forget," Katya stated with pure, unbreakable steel. "And neither will I. I am absolutely not running away, Roman. I am absolutely not a pathetic coward." Roman stared deeply, intensely at her. His piercing eyes aggressively searched hers. "If you fiercely choose to actively stay, there will absolutely be zero way back. You will permanently, completely become an absolute part of the family. You will become a highly valuable, massive target forever. I have been completely, utterly invisible my entire pathetic life," Katya whispered softly, aggressively stepping significantly closer to him, fearlessly crossing the massive distance that he was absolutely terrified to cross. "Perhaps I am completely, utterly exhausted of being pathetically invisible." The heavy air between them violently sparked. Massive danger, blinding adrenaline, pure fear. Absolutely all of it flawlessly melted directly into a highly magnetic, terrifying attraction. Roman stared intensely at her soft lips, then slowly raised his gaze directly into her beautiful eyes. "Do you have any absolute idea exactly what the hell you are actively asking for?" he rasped heavily. "Tell me, are you actively asking to permanently belong entirely to the devil?" Before Katya could even attempt to answer, the bright lights in the long hallway violently flickered and completely died. Absolute, pitch-black darkness violently swallowed them whole. "Get down!" Roman violently roared. He aggressively shoved Katya, violently tackling her completely to the hardwood floor, the absolute exact microsecond that the massive window at the absolute end of the hallway violently shattered into a million pieces. A highly bright, lethal red laser dot rapidly swept entirely across the dusty air, exactly where they had been standing just 1 second ago. Thwip! Thwip! Silenced, highly lethal bullets violently tore directly into the heavy plaster of the wall. "They are actively here!" Roman violently snarled, aggressively shielding Katya's entire body completely with his own massive frame. Andrei absolutely hadn't waited. He aggressively dragged Katya completely back into the massive bedroom and violently kicked the heavy door completely shut. "Lyova!" Katya frantically crawled in the pitch-black darkness directly toward the massive bed. "Grab him!" Roman ordered aggressively. He violently moved directly toward the wall, aggressively pressing a highly hidden secret panel. A massive section of the expensive wall silently slid open, completely revealing a dark, incredibly narrow, steep chute. "The elite panic room! Go! Right now!" "What exactly about you?" Katya cried out, violently scooping the highly sleepy, terrified Lyova entirely into her arms. Roman stood confidently right by the heavy door. His massive gun was aggressively raised. His terrifying silhouette was perfectly highlighted directly against the pale moonlight, violently pouring completely through the shattered window. "I am going to violently murder my arrogant brother," Roman stated incredibly calmly. "Go, Katya. If I absolutely do not make it completely out, explicitly tell Lyova that I fiercely loved him. Roman knew. Go!" He violently shoved them directly toward the dark chute. Katya violently pressed Lyova incredibly tight to her chest and smoothly slid entirely into the terrifying darkness. Massive, deafening gunshots violently erupted in the massive bedroom directly behind her. The dark chute was incredibly steep and terrifyingly fast. Katya violently rolled out directly onto a highly freezing, solid concrete floor. Lyova was aggressively clinging completely to her chest. She groaned loudly as her elbow violently smashed completely against a hard surface, but she absolutely did not let go of the boy. They were securely inside the massive bunker. It was a highly stark, terrifying contrast to the absolute luxury of the upper floors. The massive walls were heavily reinforced with solid steel, completely lined with highly advanced security monitors, massive crates of emergency supplies, and a massive weapons rack that looked exactly as if it belonged entirely to a highly advanced military armory. The stale air aggressively smelled heavily recycled and highly metallic. "My bad leg violently hurts," Lyova whimpered softly. Hot tears were rapidly streaming completely down his face. "I know, sweetie. I absolutely know," Katya whispered softly, frantically scrambling directly to her feet. She quickly, aggressively scanned the massive room. There was a highly heavy, massive steel vault door entirely equipped with an advanced digital keypad and a massive, heavy wheel lock. It was completely, tightly sealed. She aggressively ran directly to the massive bank of monitors. Her heart completely, violently stopped. The glowing screens were actively broadcasting highly terrifying live footage from completely all across the massive mansion. It was an absolute bloody slaughterhouse. The lifeless bodies of Roman's elite guards lay violently scattered completely across the luxurious hallways. Thick black smoke entirely filled the grand foyer. And then, she vividly saw him on the screen explicitly labeled Master Bedroom. Roman was actively, violently fighting. He was an absolute, terrifying whirlwind of pure, unadulterated violence, aggressively using a highly heavy, solid brass lamp to brutally bludgeon a highly armed attacker. But there were way too incredibly many of them. She watched in pure, adulterated horror, aggressively covering her mouth with her hand, as a massive man in a heavy tactical vest violently shot Roman directly in the broad shoulder. Roman violently staggered backward, dropping heavily directly onto one knee. "Papa!" Lyova violently screamed, aggressively pointing directly at the glowing screen. "Do absolutely not look," Katya stated, violently turning him entirely away and aggressively pressing his face completely into her chest. "Do absolutely not look, Lyova." She helplessly, agonizingly watched as the heavily armed attackers violently swarmed completely around Roman. But they absolutely did not kill him. They violently kicked the massive gun completely out of his hand and aggressively zip-tied his massive wrists tightly together. A brand new man confidently walked directly into the frame. He was perfectly, flawlessly dressed entirely in a pristine white suit, completely untouched by the massive blood and thick dirt. He looked incredibly, strikingly, exactly like Roman, but his face was significantly softer, and his highly arrogant smile was incredibly cruel and heavily twisted. Andrei Morozov. Katya intensely watched the screen as Andrei smoothly crouched down and whispered something highly toxic directly to Roman. He violently smashed the heavy butt of his handgun completely across his own brother's face. Then, Andrei slowly turned and looked directly, piercingly right into the hidden camera in the bedroom. He smirked toxically. He aggressively pulled a heavy walkie-talkie completely out of his pocket. Suddenly, a highly crackling, arrogant voice violently echoed over the massive intercom, completely inside the secure panic room. "I profoundly know that you are actively in there, you pathetic little waitress. And I absolutely know that you actively possess my biological nephew." Katya stared blankly at the massive speaker, violently trembling. The highly heavy, massive steel wheel on the panic room door aggressively began to slowly rotate. Clank! Katya's blood turned to absolute freezing ice. They absolutely were not safe. There was literally nowhere else to hide. She quickly looked at Lyova. He was violently trembling. His tiny eyes were completely, tightly squeezed shut. She rapidly looked directly at the massive weapons rack completely on the wall. Advanced assault rifles, heavy shotguns, massive handguns. She had absolutely never, ever held a highly lethal weapon in her entire life. She was just a pathetic waitress. She aggressively carried heavy food trays, absolutely not massive Glocks, but intensely watching the massive wheel slowly turn. Something massive and completely unbreakable violently snapped deep inside Katya Mironova. The blinding fear absolutely did not vanish, but it perfectly crystallized into a highly freezing, rock-hard determination. She was absolutely, 100% not going to allow them to violently take this beautiful boy. She aggressively sprinted directly to the massive rack and violently snatched the absolute smallest, lightest handgun she could rapidly find. A highly sleek, black 9mm. It was significantly heavier than she ever expected. She had absolutely zero idea if the safety was on. She had no idea if it was even loaded. She frantically, violently yanked the heavy slide completely back, exactly as she had vividly seen in aggressive action movies. A highly lethal brass bullet was clearly visible directly in the chamber. "Lyova," she stated. Her voice was shockingly, terrifyingly steady. "Get completely behind those heavy crates. Tightly cover your ears. Tightly close your eyes. Aggressively count directly to exactly 100. Do absolutely not stop counting. Lara, go!" she violently yelled. Lyova violently scrambled completely behind a massive stack of heavy MRE supply crates. The heavy wheel turned one absolute final time. The massive hydraulic seal hissed loudly. The heavy steel door violently swung completely open. Andrei Morozov confidently, arrogantly, strolled completely inside. Heavily flanked by exactly 2 massive, highly armed mercenaries holding assault rifles. Andrei arrogantly surveyed the massive bunker with a highly toxic, dismissive sneer. "Incredibly cozy," he muttered. His toxic gaze violently landed directly on Katya. She was standing perfectly in the absolute center of the massive room, violently trembling exactly like a fragile leaf, aggressively gripping the heavy handgun tightly with both hands, aiming it flawlessly directly at his chest. Andrei laughed. A highly genuine, loud, barking laugh. "Oh, just look closely at this. The pathetic little waitress genuinely thinks she is a highly trained elite soldier. Drop it right now, sweetheart. You are aggressively going to get yourself violently killed." "Get the hell out," Katya stated. Her voice violently trembled, but the massive gun absolutely did not waver. "Exactly where is the boy?" Andrei aggressively took a confident step forward. I explicitly said, get the hell out! Violently kill her, Andre coldly ordered his highly armed guards. The massive guard, directly on the left, aggressively raised his heavy rifle. Katya absolutely did not think. She absolutely did not aim. She simply, violently, squeezed the heavy trigger. Bang! The massive sound was absolutely deafening inside the small concrete room. The highly violent recoil aggressively, painfully jerked her arms completely upward. She completely missed the armed guard, but the lethal bullet violently struck a massive heavy fire extinguisher, securely mounted directly to the wall, exactly next to Andre's arrogant head. The massive canister violently, explosively ruptured, completely filling the entire bunker entrance with a massive, blinding cloud of highly toxic white chemical foam and thick smoke. My damn eyes! Andre violently screamed, aggressively clawing at his face. Absolute, total chaos violently erupted. The highly armed guards aggressively began firing completely blindly directly into the room. Lethal bullets violently sparked completely off the concrete floor and the steel walls. Katya violently dove completely behind a massive metal desk, aggressively covering her head. Lyova, stay completely down. She aggressively peeked completely over the heavy desk. The thick white smoke was incredibly dense, completely blinding the highly armed attackers. She vividly saw a massive shadow aggressively moving directly within the thick fog. She violently fired again. Bang! Then again. Bang! She had absolutely zero idea exactly what she was actively hitting, but she was aggressively making them violently hesitate. Toss a massive grenade! One of the armed guards violently yelled. Toss a damn grenade! No! Andre violently screamed, aggressively coughing from the toxic smoke. If you violently kill the damn boy, I completely lose absolutely all my massive leverage. Get in there and violently grab them. A massive guard violently lunged completely out of the thick smoke, aggressively charging directly toward the heavy desk. Katya desperately aimed. Her hands were shaking violently. She aggressively squeezed the heavy trigger. Click. She had completely forgotten to check the magazine. It was completely empty, or fatally jammed. The massive guard violently grabbed her directly by her hair and aggressively yanked her completely out from behind the heavy desk. Katya violently screamed, aggressively kicking and frantically scratching. She violently raked her sharp nails directly across his face, aggressively drawing bright red blood. He groaned loudly and violently backhanded her completely across the face, aggressively sending her violently crashing completely into the hard metal wall. Her vision instantly, violently blurred. She physically tasted strong, metallic copper in her mouth. The massive guard heavily loomed directly over her, aggressively raising the heavy butt of his massive rifle completely high to violently smash her skull. Good night, bitch. A highly sickening, massive crunch violently echoed loudly through the room, but Katya absolutely didn't feel it. The massive guard's eyes went completely wide. He swayed violently, then collapsed heavily forward, completely revealing Roman Morozov standing entirely behind him. Roman looked exactly like a terrifying, lethal demon, violently rising completely from the depths of hell. His massive hands were absolutely still zip-tied tightly in front of him, but the thick plastic was heavily stretched and entirely bloody, where he had violently rubbed it aggressively against a sharp, jagged edge. Tightly in his bound hands, he fiercely held a massive, highly heavy steel wrench. His crisp shirt was completely soaked entirely through with bright red blood from the massive gunshot wound in his shoulder. His handsome face was a highly terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated, absolute fury. You violently touched her, Roman whispered incredibly softly. The second massive guard aggressively took careful aim directly at Roman. Roman violently moved with absolute, impossible speed, aggressively utilizing the falling body of the absolute first guard entirely as a massive human shield. The lethal bullets violently tore entirely through the dead man. Roman violently lunged aggressively forward, brutally attacking the second armed guard. He aggressively wrapped his tightly bound arms completely around the man's thick neck and violently yanked. Snap! The massive guard instantly went completely limp. Andrei Morozov stood completely frozen by the heavy door, frantically wiping the toxic foam completely from his eyes. He blinked rapidly, violently clearing his vision exactly in time to vividly see his two highly elite, heavily armed mercenaries completely dead directly on the floor, and his massive, terrifying brother, entirely covered in thick blood, slowly turning directly toward him. Andrei frantically fumbled aggressively for his own handgun. Roman absolutely did not run. He slowly, deliberately took highly measured, incredibly terrifying steps. Andrei violently fired. The lethal bullet aggressively grazed Roman's ribs. Roman absolutely didn't even flinch. "Stay the hell back!" Andrei violently screamed, frantically retreating until he aggressively hit the hard door frame. "I am your biological brother. You absolutely cannot murder family." Roman completely stopped exactly mere inches completely away from him. He stared intensely at the massive gun shaking in Andrei's hand, then slowly looked up directly into his brother's terrified, panicked eyes. "You permanently stopped being my family the absolute exact moment you violently threatened my biological son," Roman stated incredibly quietly. Roman aggressively raised his tightly bound hands, incredibly high, and violently brought them completely down in a highly ferocious, devastating arc. The massive, heavy wrench violently smashed directly into Andrei's wrist, brutally shattering the thick bone completely. The heavy gun violently clattered loudly to the concrete floor. Roman aggressively grabbed Andrei directly by the throat with both of his massive bound hands, violently slamming him completely against the hard steel wall. He aggressively began to violently squeeze. "Roman." Katya's soft, fragile voice violently sliced directly through the thick veil of blinding red fury. Roman completely froze. He absolutely did not take his piercing eyes completely off Andrei, whose face was rapidly turning bright, suffocating blue. But he completely stopped violently squeezing. "Lyova is actively watching," Katya whispered incredibly softly. Roman's piercing eyes violently darted completely to the dark corner. Lyova was terrifiedly peeking completely out from behind the heavy crates, his massive eyes completely wide with pure, unadulterated horror. Roman slowly looked completely back at Andrei. He gradually, highly deliberately, loosened his violent grip. Andrei violently slid completely down the hard wall, desperately gasping highly for air, frantically clutching his bruised throat. "You are absolutely right," Roman stated firmly. He confidently turned his broad back completely away from his brother. "Demyan!" Demyan instantly appeared completely in the heavy doorway, entirely covered in thick blood, but miraculously alive, aggressively leading a massive second wave of highly loyal, elite Morozov soldiers who had finally, successfully violently reclaimed the massive house. "Aggressively take him completely away," Roman coldly ordered, pointing dismissively at the desperately gasping Andrei. "Securely lock him completely in the massive warehouse. I will personally, violently, deal with him significantly later, entirely when my biological son is absolutely not actively around." Demyan nodded incredibly grimly. Two massive men violently dragged the sobbing, pathetic Andrei completely away. Roman stood completely still in the absolute center of the massive room, slightly, visibly swaying. The massive adrenaline was rapidly, violently fading, and the massive blood loss was completely, terrifyingly catching up to him. He looked deeply at Katya. She was heavily bruised. Bright blood was actively leaking completely from her cut lip. Her hair was entirely matted with thick sweat. She looked absolutely, undeniably beautiful. He slowly took exactly one step directly toward her. Then, his massive knees completely, violently buckled. "Roman!" Katya violently lunged forward, aggressively catching his massive body completely before he violently hit the hard ground. They violently collapsed entirely together onto the freezing cold concrete. "You!" Roman rasped incredibly heavily, his massive head resting completely comfortably entirely in her soft lap. "You aggressively shot the massive fire extinguisher. Incredibly smart." "I was actually desperately aiming directly for his arrogant head," Katya confessed softly. Hot tears beautifully mixed completely with the bright blood entirely on her face. Roman let out a highly weak, incredibly soft chuckle that rapidly turned directly into a painful cough. "Please profoundly remind me to absolutely never, ever violently anger you." His piercing eyes slowly, heavily rolled entirely back, and he went completely, utterly limp directly in her arms. "Doctor!" Katya violently screamed. Her terrified voice echoed loudly, frantically, entirely off the steel walls. "We urgently need the doctor right now!" Interactive question. Katya saved the day. What was your favorite moment of her defending Lyova? Tell us below. The Devil's Proposal. The highly rhythmic, steady beeping of the advanced heart monitor had completely become the absolute steady rhythm of Katya's brand new life. Exactly 3 agonizing days had violently passed. Roman was finally, miraculously, out of the massive intensive care unit, securely transferred completely to a highly luxurious, private medical suite, entirely in the east wing of the massive estate. The lethal bullet had miraculously passed exactly 1 single inch completely away from his lung. He was incredibly, profoundly lucky. Or, exactly as Demyan had highly accurately put it, he was simply way too incredibly stubborn to violently die. Katya sat peacefully, entirely by the massive window, quietly watching the highly expensive landscapers meticulously repair the massive, violent damage completely done to the pristine lawn. She was flawlessly wearing an incredibly expensive silk designer dress that highly likely cost significantly more than her entire car. It felt incredibly strange, yet highly beautiful against her skin. "Please completely stop actively thinking so incredibly loudly," a highly hoarse, deep voice stated completely from the massive bed. Katya violently spun around. Roman was completely awake. He looked incredibly pale, completely against the pristine white pillows. His massive shoulder was heavily, completely bandaged, but his piercing eyes were incredibly, flawlessly clear. "I absolutely wasn't actively thinking," Katya stated softly, confidently walking directly over to the massive bed. "I was just incredibly worried. Andrei is completely, permanently handled," Roman stated incredibly grimly. "The massive organization is 100% secure. There is absolutely zero threat." "I completely know. Then exactly what is it?" Katya slowly looked deeply at her soft hands. "The official social worker violently came while you were deeply asleep. She was aggressively asking massive questions entirely about the highly violent incident. My elite lawyers absolutely, flawlessly handled it, of course. They explicitly told her it was simply a highly random aggressive home invasion. They successfully paid absolutely everyone off. That is exactly how your toxic world flawlessly works, Roman. That is absolutely not exactly how my world flawlessly works," she stated incredibly quietly. In my normal world, highly violent people go directly to federal prison. In my world, we absolutely do not possess massive panic rooms and highly lethal shootouts. Roman slowly, highly carefully reached out his completely uninjured, massive hand. Katya hesitated for one microscopic second, then gently placed her soft hand perfectly into his. His massive grip was incredibly, surprisingly strong. The massive private jet entirely to Switzerland is fully fueled, Roman stated incredibly quietly. The highly authentic, secure passport is completely ready. The brand new name? Elena Romanova. There is a highly secure, massive offshore account with exactly $5 million completely waiting in Zurich. You can absolutely, freely leave right this exact second. You can happily live the exact, normal, perfectly safe life you desperately want. You can happily find a highly safe, boring man who is a pathetic accountant or a simple dentist. You can be 100% absolutely safe. Katya stared deeply, intensely at him. She thought deeply about the highly disgusting, filthy diner, about the highly toxic grease, about the incredibly rude, arrogant customers, the highly crushing loneliness of her completely empty, freezing apartment. Then, she thought deeply about the last 3 agonizing days, sitting quietly directly by Roman's massive bed, lovingly reading beautiful stories entirely to Lyova until he peacefully fell asleep. About exactly how the highly elite staff now looked directly at her, absolutely not with toxic contempt, but with pure, unadulterated, absolute respect. She had violently, fiercely fought for this family. She had literally bled completely for it. "Is that exactly what you genuinely want?" she asked softly. "You desperately want me to completely leave?" Roman slowly looked completely away, staring intensely at the high ceiling. For the absolute first time in his entire life, the terrifying, absolute dawn of the massive Mafia looked incredibly, profoundly vulnerable. "I desperately want you to be perfectly safe. I am absolutely not safe. I am absolute death, Katya. I violently destroy absolutely everything I touch." "You absolutely did not violently destroy Lyova," she fiercely argued. "You miraculously saved him." "You miraculously saved him," Roman gently corrected. "You miraculously saved both of us." "Where exactly is Lyova?" "He is happily in the massive home theater, actively watching Jurassic Park." Katya smiled radiantly. She squeezed Roman's massive hand incredibly tight. "If I aggressively fly to Switzerland, who exactly is going to fiercely force him to eat his green spinach?" Roman slowly looked directly back at her. A massive, raw, highly unprotected flash of pure hope violently ignited completely in his dark eyes. "We could easily hire a highly elite nanny." "He absolutely does not want a pathetic nanny," Katya stated firmly. She slowly leaned entirely forward. Her beautiful face was mere microscopic inches completely away from his. "And I absolutely do not want a pathetic dentist." "Katya," Roman fiercely warned her. His deep voice was incredibly low and highly dangerous. "If you fiercely choose to stay, there is absolutely zero way out. You are completely, 100% mine. Today, tomorrow, entirely until the exact day I violently die. You will proudly wear my massive ring. You will fiercely carry my terrifying name. And absolutely everyone who ever looks directly at you will profoundly know that physically touching you is an absolute, immediate declaration of massive war directly against the entire Morozov family." "I completely know," she whispered incredibly softly. "Explicitly say it," he firmly commanded. "Explicitly say that you completely, profoundly understand." I completely understand. I am absolutely not going anywhere, Roman. I am officially home." Roman exhaled completely with a highly raspy, heavy breath. He aggressively, violently, pulled her completely down. His massive hand completely tangled entirely in her beautiful hair. He kissed her incredibly deeply. It absolutely wasn't gentle. It was highly possessive, incredibly desperate, and violently searing. It tasted exactly like raw pain and massive, unbreakable promises. It was the absolute permanent seal entirely on a massive contract, completely written in pure blood. The epilogue, owning the night. Exactly 6 beautiful months later, the massive, highly exclusive charity gala, exclusively for the elite Moscow Children's Hospital, was undeniably the absolute social event of the entire season. The massive grand ballroom was completely packed with the absolute highest elite of the city, highly powerful politicians, corrupt federal judges, massive celebrities, and the highly lethal power brokers who actively pulled the massive strings completely from the dark shadows. The loud, chaotic room instantly fell completely, utterly silent, when the massive, heavy double doors violently swung wide open. Roman Morozov confidently walked in. He looked completely regal and absolutely untouchable in a flawless, bespoke tuxedo. His massive shoulder had completely, entirely healed. His terrifying, absolute presence instantly, violently dominated the entire massive room. But absolutely every single eye was entirely, violently glued completely to the beautiful woman, proudly walking directly on his arm. Katya Morozova was utterly, completely breathtaking. She was flawlessly wearing a stunning, midnight blue velvet designer gown that perfectly hugged her incredible curves, completely dusted with massive, authentic diamonds. Her beautiful hair was elegantly swept completely up, flawlessly revealing the highly graceful, beautiful line of her delicate neck. But it absolutely wasn't the incredibly expensive dress or the massive, priceless jewels that completely captivated the massive room. It was her piercing, untouchable eyes. Gone completely was the highly exhausted, terrified, pathetic waitress. Completely in her place was a terrifyingly powerful woman who proudly held her beautiful head incredibly high, who intensely scanned the massive room with a highly cold, incredibly calculating, absolute gaze. On her delicate left hand, a massive, multi-million-dollar diamond ring violently sparkled blindingly completely under the massive chandeliers. "They are actively staring," Roman murmured incredibly softly, directly into her ear as they confidently descended the grand, sweeping staircase. "Let them actively stare," Katya replied smoothly. Her beautiful voice was exactly as smooth as expensive silk. "They are desperately wondering exactly how the pathetic waitress miraculously tamed the terrifying wolf. They are absolutely terrified of you," Roman proudly corrected, with a highly toxic, massive smirk. The horrific story of the massive panic room violently spread. "They aggressively say you brutally killed exactly 3 massive men entirely with a heavy fire extinguisher." Katya laughed incredibly softly. "It was absolutely only 3. Massive rumors spread incredibly fast. They confidently reached the absolute bottom of the massive stairs. A highly sweating, highly corrupt federal senator frantically approached, nervously extending his shaking hand. "Mr. Morozov and Mrs. Morozova, it is an absolute massive honor." Katya slowly took the senator's sweating hand. She absolutely did not squeeze aggressively, but her firm grip was exactly as hard as solid iron. She smiled brightly, but her beautiful smile absolutely did not reach her piercing eyes. "Senator," she stated incredibly smoothly, My powerful husband explicitly tells me that you are actively, aggressively delaying the massive zoning permits entirely for our brand new elite warehouse. I highly hope we can rapidly resolve that minor issue tonight. I would absolutely hate for things to become incredibly complicated. The corrupt senator completely, violently paled. He desperately looked directly at Roman. Roman simply shrugged effortlessly, intensely looking at his beautiful wife with pure, unadulterated, massive pride. "You clearly heard the powerful lady, Senator," Roman stated smoothly. "And my beautiful wife, she possesses an incredibly terrifying, absolute temper." As the highly terrified senator violently stuttered pathetic apologies and frantically hurried completely away, Katya physically felt a tiny, gentle tug entirely on her expensive dress. She slowly looked directly down. It was little Leova, looking absolutely dashing and incredibly adorable in a tiny, miniature, bespoke tuxedo. He was strictly supposed to be completely with his highly elite nanny, but he had flawlessly managed to successfully slip inside. "Mama," he whispered incredibly softly. "It is incredibly boring. Can we please go aggressively get massive burgers?" Katya's heart completely, violently, swelled entirely at the beautiful word, "Mama." It had taken exactly 3 agonizing months for him to finally, beautifully say it. And every single time he did, it physically felt exactly like the absolute greatest gift in the entire world. She looked deeply at Roman. He was intensely, lovingly watching them. His dark, piercing eyes were completely filled with such a massive, fierce, unadulterated love that it could have easily burned the entire world completely to the ground. "Massive burgers," Katya mused incredibly thoughtfully. "Well, absolutely first, we urgently need to aggressively make our massive donation. Then, perhaps we can successfully quietly slip completely out the heavy back door." "Sasha's diner?" Roman asked softly, slowly raising a dark eyebrow. "Sasha's diner," Katya firmly confirmed. Roman Morozov, the absolute terrifying king of Moscow, confidently took his powerful wife's hand and the tiny hand of his beautiful son. "Lead the absolute way, my beautiful queen." They confidently walked directly through the massive crowd, effortlessly parting the sea of the terrifying elite, exactly like an untouchable royal family. Katya absolutely did not look back at the pathetic, miserable life she had completely left behind. She had violently walked completely through the burning fire and miraculously emerged entirely on the other side. Absolutely not just as a pathetic survivor, but as an absolute, terrifying ruler. She had desperately called the devil for help, and in the absolute end, she absolutely didn't just brilliantly survive completely next to him. She flawlessly learned exactly how to fiercely, completely love him. And entirely together, they absolutely owned the entire night. What an incredible, massive journey. From a lonely shift in a highly depressing, cheap diner directly to the absolute throne of the terrifying Moscow underworld. Katya miraculously proved that sometimes the exact person who flawlessly saves you isn't a pathetic knight in shining armor, but the absolute monster that absolutely everyone else is terrified of. What did you guys think? Would you have stayed with Roman? Tell me in the comments below. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell because some massive secrets are absolutely worth waiting for. See you in the next one.